The Heretaunga Plains are located in Hawke's Bay. They're 300 square kilometre alluvial plains. They encapsulate, or Hastings, Havelock North and Napier are all in the Heretaunga Plains. And by an alluvial plains, what that means is that the land that makes up the plains, so the gravel, the sand and the silt, are all bought by the rivers. There's three main rivers that flow through the Heretaunga Plains. They are the Ngaruroro, Tukekuri and Tukituki rivers. Because the Heretaunga Plains are plains, it means that they're expansive, flat land. These rivers, they're not flowing through massive canyons like in the Waikato River, where there's like 20 meters walls. These are just small, not small rivers, but not super deep, and then flat plains for as far as you can see. And so before pre-European settlement, it was actually swampland because the rivers could easily flood and go out along all of the Heretaunga Plains. Upon European settlement, essentially they saw masses of flat land, and because they're alluvial deposits, like the earth is brought down by the rivers, they're really fertile lands, and so they turned the swampland and they drained it, so it's called reclaimed land. And how they do that is they essentially just dig big tunnels and to redirect all of the water that comes out of the rivers to just flow into the rivers, which stops it from being swampland. However, because it is a plain and there's not a deep canyon for the river to go into, it is very prone to flooding. And in 1867, so the first proper recording of mass destruction, because obviously when the Europeans settled, they drained the waters out of the swampland and into the main rivers, and then built around that river. However, they didn't build massive stop banks and stuff like that. So in 1867, the Ngaruroro River flooded, causing masses of destruction. And you can kind of imagine because a river meanders, which means it bends left and right, and why rivers flow is because the water's following gravity to the ocean. And so when there's lots of water, instead of going around the bend, the banks of the river will break and the water will find a more direct route into the ocean. And so that happened, destroyed a whole bunch of stuff like farmland, and because as I said, it's very fertile land, so that was the basis of reclaiming the land, was to plant things and do some farming. So when that happened, there's been, essentially since that in 1867, been extensive work to put structural supports in to make sure that the riverbanks don't overflow and the plains don't become swampland again. And so the Ngaruroro River is one of the rivers that flooded in this 2023 cyclone, the Gabriel cyclone. So obviously extensive engineering efforts and modern day technology goes into keeping the rivers in the place that we want them to be, because we've built around them based on where they are, not where they could be. And one of the things that we've done is we've employed bioengineering. And what bioengineering is using plants and the pre-existing relationships in nature as a mean to provide structural support. And so if you go down to the river, you'll find that there's lots of willow trees and shrubs. And the reason that there's lots of willow trees and shrubs is that the willow trees have really strong primary and secondary roots. And the way to think about that is they're like long fingers that stick into the ground and hold the dirt. So the willow tree has really long fingers. Then you'll also see the willow shrub. The willow shrub has a different root system. It's much more dense and finer roots. So the willow tree, its roots go deep into the ground and hold on, whereas the willow shrub just stays around the surface and holds all that top layer of the soil. And so the roots you can think of as like fingers holding on to the dirt to stop the natural erosion that happens at the edge of a riverbank, to stop the river from changing its shape and, eventually breaking the bridges and all that stuff that we've built around it. The reason why willow trees are chosen is because there's not actually many plants that like being surrounded by so much water, and we all know that plants need water to survive, but it's actually plants are just as likely to die from overwatering as they are from underwatering. You can drown a plant. And when you dig up the dirt, there's pockets of oxygen, and plant roots need oxygen in order to survive. And so there's not many plants that are adapted to living in such wet conditions, like a riverbank. And so the willow tree is quite rare because it is actually able to support roots that just go into the river and they absorb the water straight from the river. So they're not in the dirt at all, they're just in the river. And also, because it's a river, things are flowing, there's debris. The willow tree roots are really strong, and so when the debris hits into them, they're not as likely to be damaged compared to lots of other plants. Obviously, the willow isn't a native to New Zealand, and the type of willow that you'll find along the riverbanks is so willows belong to the family called the Salix, and the version that we have is the Salix mitsunda hybridized with the Alba. And so the Salix mitsunda is the Chinese willow tree, and the Alba is the European willow tree from Italy. And so we have a hybrid between those two. And because it's not a native, there's a high chance of it becoming a weed. Essentially, we don't want non-native plant species growing around. And so what they do is you just plant male willows along riverbanks because they can't produce seeds. And so if they can't produce seeds, then they can't have seed distribution going everywhere. And like willow trees, there is a risk of them becoming more invasive because when branches fall off, they can then root. But by only planting males and stopping seed production, it means that widespread distribution of the willow trees is reduced because branches will just kind of fall on the ground and then sprout there, whereas seeds can be taken by birds, wind, they can fall into the water, go ages away. They're much more efficient means of distributing a plant. So if you take that method of reproducing away, then it regulates the numbers. Another thing that you'll find down at the river is the toitoi. I thought it was spelled Toi, but it's actually Toe. Common misconception. Here in Aotearoa we have 5 different types of toitoi, and the reason they're chosen is again based on their ability to handle such high water levels, or a lot of water, again based around their roots, because you'll find that toitoi are often in swampland, marshes and things like that where there's lots and lots of water, so they're able to handle those higher water levels that lots and lots of plants aren't adapted to. The great thing, or the bonus of planting the toitoi, is increasing the biodiversity, because toitoi are a native to New Zealand, they're endemic to New Zealand, and so if you plant things that are evolved here in Aotearoa, they have pre-existing relationships with all of the other plants and animals that evolved here. So that increases the biodiversity, which is ultimately awesome, and it makes just life a lot more beautiful. Another good thing is that the toitoi, because they're a tussock, they're our largest native grass, and because of that they are able to suppress weeds. And as I said before, the willow tree, the branches are able to fall off and then sprout. But if you've got lots of toitoi covering the ground, then these are less likely to grow, because they're essentially a weed that the toitoi is suppressing. But the willow trees that are already there, we need, because they provide structural support. But the ones that may propagate due to branches falling off and then sprouting, they're more likely to be suppressed when you have toitoi planted there. One thing I learned while looking at this is about pampas. So toitoi, native to New Zealand, tussock grass, very easy to identify with that massive flower with the white thing at the top. But there's actually an invasive species called the pampas from South America, and there's a few minor differences on how to identify which is which, but generally they're very similar. The easiest way to identify it is that the toitoi flower between September and January, whereas the pampas flower between January and June. So all of the ones that I originally thought were toitoi, because since it's June right now, I identified them based on them flowering, but those are actually the pampas. So all of the toitoi flowers are dead by now. One thing I forgot to say, which is cool about the roots and how they hold on. So the roots are like fingers holding onto the dirt. When you dig up dirt and you see like chunks in the dirt, what that is, those chunks are actually a relationship between the bacteria and the fungi and the roots of plants together. So having the roots in the dirt not only like physically holds the dirt together, but it makes the most, or utilizes the relationships between bacteria, fungi, and roots, and causes the aggregations of soil and makes it even stronger than it normally would be. Yeah, that's the riverbank.